Hello everyone, Ben here, and welcome to my follow-up video from last week, where I did the 10 worst. Well, we saved the best for last, and we're doing the 10 best presidents in United States history. And, well, some of this is my opinion. I will admit that I did include some personal biases to a degree. However, I feel this is a good list, and I will explain why on any pick that might be a little controversial. I also included a president who is not on my personal 10 best list, simply because the general feeling of his presidency is that it was a very good one, and he is on most people's 10 best, even if they disagree with his policies. So, anyway, without further ado, let's get going. Also, it's going to go president name, years served, party affiliation. And at number 10, we have Dwight Eisenhower. I like Ike. Very moderate Republican, governed over the 50s, which was seen as a booming time for the U.S. economy and is considered the golden age of U.S. culture in some respects. He oversaw the creation of the interstate highway system, which has made the United States much more traversable. Generally, you can't find a bad opinion of his presidency, except from the most hardline Democrats, and even then they admit he did a lot of good for the nation. Or the most hardline libertarians, because he did expand the federal government and he didn't really take care of the debt from World War II. But again, those are the very vocal minority of opinions. I think most people think his presidency was exceedingly good, and he often finds himself onto these lists. Number 9, John Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK. 1961 to 1963, Democrat. He gets ranked a lot higher than I think he should because he was assassinated and he was extremely popular. I think this is a better spot for him because he had some big failures during his presidency, in addition to the one or two big wins he had. The big win he had was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I don't think I need to go over how important that was in world history, let alone U.S. history. The other big win is he kind of set off the Democrats going more towards the civil rights side of thing. He convinced a lot of Democrats, including his vice president, to LBJ, to become a little more amicable towards civil rights. While he didn't get the entire party along with this, people like Strom Thurmond opposed the move. He definitely helped turn a new leaf in that regard for the Democrats. The other major win for him was NASA. Remember, by the end of the decade, we will put a man on the moon. Well, we did. We put a man on the moon, thanks to Kennedy declaring that is our goal. So I think this is a modest spot for him. I could see him being, 7th or 8th, a little bit higher than this, but I personally wouldn't put him in the top 5. I think that's just as sad as it is to say. I think the only reason he gets ranked as high as he does is because he was assassinated. And number 8, Calvin Coolidge. This one's a little bit of personal bias. On my personal list, he's in the top 3, but I can't really justify putting him that high on a serious list. So I put him at number 8 because, number 1, he oversaw the greatest economic boom this nation has ever seen. He removed a lot of the corruption that plagued the Warren G. Harding administration. And generally speaking, he did everything he could to ensure that the federal government was as small but efficient as possible. In addition, he enforced policies that he disagreed with because it was his job, to put it in his own words, it was his job to enforce policies like prohibition, which he was personally against. He really did the job of president extremely well. A lot of people will try and blame him for the stock market crash of 1929, but he is really blameless in that regard. If you actually look up the economic information, the fundamentals would have plagued any president in 1929. And unfortunately, it fell to Herbert Hoover, who took all of the blame at the time, and nowadays Calvin Coolidge gets the blame because he was the president preceding the crash. But he really shouldn't get much blame, if any, and instead the blame should fall to the Federal Reserve, which was just learning about monetary policy and how to use it. I really don't consider, even if it was a terrible Democrat president, I would not blame him for the stock market crash of 1929, even if it was someone I completely disagreed with. Because we have to admit the actuality that it was just the perfect storm of economic events that caused the Great Depression. Germany being unable to pay its war reparations from World War I, and taking out U.S. loans that the U.S. called in as soon as the market crashed. That exacerbated it. And okay, it makes sense that we called in the loans. Germany was financially unstable. We wanted our money back as quickly as possible. Poor farming practices in the Midwest. It happens. The Federal Reserve not knowing how to deal with monetary policy. They still don't, to be quite honest with you. There's good reason to believe the 2008 crash had a lot to do with the Federal Reserve. And there's good reason to remove the Federal Reserve. But anyway, about Calvin Coolidge, just look up his reputation as Silent Cal. You'll understand that this is a person who really only wanted to do his job. He was known for busting corruption. While he was anti-union, there was good reason to be anti-union at the time. Unions tend to be a lot more violent than they are today, and were surprisingly more politically involved at the time than they were today, or than they are today. Really, he was a very good president who just happened to have one of the worst actually the worst economic crash follow his presidency. He was a little unlucky in that regard. Andrew Jackson, the first Democrat to become president. He founded the Democrat Party. Now, a lot of people put him on their worst lists because of the whole Indian Removal Act. And yes, that was a bad policy and a bad law. And you really can't excuse that. At the same time, we do also have to look at what he did positively for the nation. He killed the national bank. He made the U.S. debt-free for the only time in its history. Also, that should be 1837, not 1827. Yeah, oops. I think I hit 2. Yeah, anyway. But yeah, he is the reason the United States became debt-free at one point. That didn't last long because of Martin Van Buren, who immediately followed him. But You have to give credit where credit's due. He is the only president to see a debt-free United States. Not just a deficit-free, a debt-free United States. He really brought the nation, to some semblance of prosperity and started it on its path as to becoming a world power. Despite, again, the one blemish of his presidency. So he's a much better president than a lot of people will give him credit for because he was a flaming racist. But he was a very good president. James Monroe, 1817 to 1825, Democrat Republican. He, well, if you need to know if you need just 2 words to summarize his presidency, look up the Monroe Doctrine. He was the person who set up the basis for U.S. foreign policy since he put it down. Or to put it another way, all foreign policy objectives the United States is undertaking can be tied to the Monroe Doctrine, which is incredible. Monroe oversaw what's known as the era of good feelings. The only time in U.S. history where there has only been one political party. And while that political party immediately fractured after his presidency, no one seriously challenged him. Now, at the time, a lot of people thought he was a mediocre president. So much so that the only person to cast an electoral vote against him in 1820 did so because he thought he was a mediocre president, and not, as legend states, to ensure that George Washington is the only person who was ever elected unanimously in the Electoral College. But that just goes to show he was so popular, no one actually did run against him. He ran for president unopposed in 1820. He did have a competitor in 1816, but in 1820 he did not. And that should go to say just how popular he was. He was actually a good president, and despite a small economic downturn in 1819, the nation immediately recovered, and to say anything bad about him, it's really hard to find a blemish on his presidency. Number 5, Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, Republican. The Bull Moose, the Rough Rider, the guy who created the national park system, the guy who created the USDA, which is at the time was definitely a government agency that was needed. Even I couldn't find a reason to not have the USDA in the early 1900s. Nowadays, I can find a few, but they're still a little unconvincing. But Theodore Roosevelt, man, this guy was a pretty baller president. He really, really set the bar high when it came to, believe it or not, there was an era where Republicans were considered progressives. While there was definitely a conservative wing of the party, a lot of people wanted small government programs that could effectively do their job, but at the same time allow business to flourish. In addition, Theodore Roosevelt was a person who came up with the idea of trust busting and anti-monopoly measures. He was a person who implemented them, but at the same time, he understood that there were some industries where monopolies were beneficial to the American people rather than harmful. And so he had a very steady hand when it came to trust busting. Spanish-American war hero. The list of this guy's accomplishments are just too many to list out in a short video, and you just need to look him up yourself. Theodore Roosevelt was awesome. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933 to 1945, Democrat. While personally I don't even put him on this list, most people view his presidency as very good, and it's pretty evident. He won 4 presidential elections. And that's actually one of the reasons why I don't have him on my list, is he ran for more than 2 terms. I think that was a very poor choice, and that is one of the biggest blemishes of his presidency. In retrospect, Social Security was probably a program that should have been dismantled after the war, and those who were on Social Security should have been grandfathered in order to allow them to continue to take their pay. But after the Great Depression was over, Social Security probably should have been dismantled. And a lot of his economic recovery policies, in the short term, they may be made worse, the Great Depression, but eventually the Great Depression did disappear, and there was economic recovery during his presidency. Partially due to the absolutely massive spending projects that were undertaken during his presidency, and of course to World War II, which is the primary reason why the Great Depression ended. Anyone saying that Roosevelt's recovery would have just the economic policies he instituted, as well as some of the welfare programs, anybody who says that those were the sole reason we came out of the Depression is just wrong. And the reason why a lot of people still believe in New Deal era policies is because of World War II, and not because of the merit of the economic policies instituted during the Roosevelt and the FDR administration. World War II is one of the reasons why a lot of people say Keynesian economics works. But that's a little scary when you think about it. But moving on to the good that he did, he tried to keep us out of World War II as long as possible, and only when we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, which admittedly they didn't believe the intelligence reports they got. As soon as we were attacked, he immediately said, okay, that's enough, we're going to war. We will not stand being attacked, To quote him, it was a day that will live on in infamy. December 7th, 1941. In addition, we also have to look at the fact that he was popular enough that he won 4 presidential elections. That must mean he was doing something right. Just overall, he did have a good presidency, but I think the long-term effects caused me to have him not even on my personal list. But I think most people have him very highly ranked, and I think this is a reasonable spot if we're trying to remove any and all bias. Overall, he honorably held the position of president. Number 3, Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 1865, Republican. the savior of the Union. He definitely, the main marker of his presidency is, of course, the Civil War, the war between the states, whatever you call it, right? He preserved the Union, but at a major cost. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and yes, while he won the Civil War, and he should get all the credit, and that's why he's so high, we do have to remember that he was not as effective a president as a lot of people seem to think. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus in a few states in order to ensure that there was no dissent. He very likely caused a few Democrat-run organizations to collapse in these border states like Maryland and Delaware, simply because he went after people who criticized some of his decisions really hard. In addition, let's not forget that he was absolutely terrible at choosing generals. And the one that finally did work was an alcoholic. He went through 3 or 4 generals who were just absolutely terrible and were getting their rear ends handed to them by General Robert E. Lee. Now, that isn't to say that Lincoln didn't try to get Robert E. Lee before Virginia seceded, because he did. But Robert E. Lee said, "There's no way I'm going to, take up arms against my neighbors, his fellow citizens of Virginia." And Lincoln's like, "Okay, fine." He tried to get Winfield Scott, but he didn't like Winfield Scott's idea of slowly constricting the South, which ironically Lincoln eventually admitted was the right plan, and then they implemented it immediately. And then Winfield Scott died. Then I believe he went to George McClellan, and that didn't work because McClellan was too passive. Eventually, he went to General Ulysses Grant, and that worked, but Ulysses Grant had a completely different style, and a lot of people didn't like the way Ulysses Grant fought the war. He made it a war of attrition that the South just couldn't win. And yeah, it was brutal. He also had a moderate plan for Reconstruction. It wasn't as passive as Andrew Johnson's, but it also wasn't as harsh as the radical Republicans in Congress. However, he was assassinated before he had a chance to implement this plan. And chances are he would have had some of it overrun or overridden by the radical Republicans in Congress. Number 2, George Washington, 1789 to 1797. Independent. Many people will also consider him a Federalist, so I put that in parentheses. But Washington refused to be a part of any party. So he could essentially be considered an independent who caucused with the Federalists. But Washington hated political parties, or as he called them, factions. He thought they were toxic to American politics. But even his warning against them, he couldn't prevent political parties from forming. He put down the Whiskey Rebellion early in his presidency. He established the precedent of presidents only serving 2 terms by saying, "I will not run again. I have done my job. I am going to leave you to your own devices. Washington generally served over a period of, good development economically. He established a lot of the things we take for granted. The cabinet, for example. He established some of our first foreign policy objectives, aka opening up trade with England and France, as well as others, and ensuring that the best people served in the jobs they were best suited for. For example, John Adams was his vice president. Though he didn't choose them, John Adams was just the person who got the second most electoral college votes. It was a weird thing, even though George Washington won unanimously. Electors cast 2 ballots for president, and you only needed to getting half of all electoral votes meant that you swept the electoral college. And the person who got the second most became vice president. He appointed Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. He appointed Henry Knox as Secretary of War. He appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. I'm trying to remember who the Attorney General was. Oh God, I should know that. And trying to remember who the Secretary of the Interior. I'm trying to remember who that was. But those 3, Henry Knox, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, very, very important in setting out the rules for those 3 departments. And in some ways, their effect lasted for a long, long time. Thomas Jefferson made the office of the state, primarily a foreign policy wing of the executive branch. The Treasury Department became an advocate for a central bank, as well as taking over the role of minting currency and setting about basic economic policy. Though some Treasury secretaries were against a national bank, sometimes some of them advocated for it, some of them advocated against it. It depends. It would mainly depend on who was president at the time. But now we're going to move on to number 1. Thomas Jefferson, 1801 to 1809. I think most people remember his presidency more for the first term than the second term. His second term was actually pretty disastrous, to be honest with you. He actually caused an economic depression with his embargo on Great Britain and France, but that was the main blemish on his presidency. Otherwise, he was an extremely good president. He oversaw another great economic boom in our history. I'd say second only to the Roaring '20s in terms of how big this boom was. He got rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts. He purchased the port of New Orleans, which at the time was needed. He was asked by Congress, hey, can you purchase New Orleans? And he's like, sure, how much are you going to give me to purchase New Orleans with? They said, we'll give you $10 million. That should be enough to convince Napoleon. He goes to Napoleon, he says, hey, Napoleon, can we buy New Orleans? And Napoleon is like, for only $5 million more, do you mind just taking all of Louisiana? And Jefferson is like, I really should talk to Congress about this, but getting the entire Mississippi, as well as the entire, I don't know what else is out there, but, that's not the worst idea possible. You know what? I'll do it. And then when he went to Congress, he realized, oh, crap, I just grossly overstepped the role of my office. Oops. Oh well, we have Louisiana, and Congress is like, whatever. You did good. And it turns out that this was quite possibly the biggest bargain in world history in terms of a purchase. For the equivalent of about $1 billion today, he purchased a swath of land that is worth a couple trillion, about $2 trillion. So, yeah, I think he kind of won with that deal. He purchased the largest food producing area in the world for $15 million, as well as the port city of New Orleans, meaning our exports could vastly increase. He gave us, it was really it really was the biggest bargain in world history. Other notable parts of his presidency. Number one, he said about the foreign policy tenet of why we don't like terrorists. He was the person who instituted the policy of we do not negotiate with terrorists. Because our ships were going about the Mediterranean and the Barbary pirates were, asking for money. They're like, hey, pay us and we'll leave you alone. And Jefferson is like, you know what? No, we're not going to pay that. We don't negotiate with terrorists. Paraphrasing, of course. And he said, we're not going to pay your bribe. And the Barbary pirates just looked at him like, are you crazy? Are you crazy? Well, let's see what happens when we take one of your ships. Now you'll pay us. And Jefferson is like, send in the Marines. Hey, you ever wonder why the Marine song goes from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli? Yeah, the Tripoli they're talking about is the Tripoli in Libya, where they crushed the Barbary pirates who had started a war with us because we refused to pay their bribe. So, thank you, Thomas Jefferson. Your effects have lasted long beyond his presidency. Now, a lot of people will say he was, a racist and, he shouldn't be ranked highly because he owned slaves. Well, yeah, but he also, interestingly, let me pull out the book, but Jefferson actually didn't mind freeing slaves. He was not against abolition of slavery. Now, the book I'm looking at is Madison's Gift, which is about the Constitution of the United States. And a very, very, very interesting proposal Jefferson had was abolishing slavery, but educating slaves so that they would be able to compete in the workforce. That's interesting. That is very interesting, right? It demonstrates that Jefferson realized that you can't just abolish slavery. It indicated that he knew that if the nation was to abolish slavery, the slave population would need to be educated, or else they wouldn't be able to contribute economically, and they would be forced into the menial tasks that they already occupied. Meaning that the situation wouldn't change in the slightest. They'd just be getting paid for their labor instead of actually developing the nation economically. I mean, at the worst, at least they would be getting paid, but under Jefferson's plan, if it were to somehow miraculously pass the Continental Congress, who knows what our nation will look like today? Seriously, that's an interesting question. If Jefferson's proposal to educate slaves had gone through and had passed, and along with the idea that slavery would be abolished, what would our nation look like today? Let's go, just in the comments, go ahead and answer that. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a nice day, and I will see you guys next time, when probably Monday or Tuesday, when I talk about the Senate race from another state. I'm not sure which one yet. Anyway, take it easy. Bye.